Terminator Dark Fate is directed by Tim Miller, written by David S. Goyer, Justin Rhodes, and Billy Ray. It is the latest entry in the Terminator franchise and attempts to right the wrongs of the previous 3 entries, all of which attempted to continue the franchise unsuccessfully. James Cameron returns with a story by and producer credit in order to revive the dying franchise. Does he succeed? For the most part, yes. The film is treated as a direct sequel to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and ignores everything that came after. The film picks up 27 years after T2, in which Sarah Connor and her son John successfully prevented Judgment Day and the creation of Skynet. Little do they know, Judgment Day is inevitable, and a new, darker future has been created. This leads to a familiar premise in which a new Terminator, called the Rev-9, is sent back from the future in order to terminate its new target, Dani Ramos. She is protected by future warrior Grace, and coming to their aid are returning stars Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor and Arnold Schwarzenegger as the T-800. Both huge reasons as to why this film succeeds more highly than its predecessors. In terms of story, Miller and co have gone back to basics, creating an action-packed chase film that almost never stops. For those hoping to see something fresher, may be disappointed. If you've seen T1 and T2, this film hits all the expected beats. The film is conflicting, because in order to do a reset on the franchise, the film has to undo the finality that came with T2's perfect ending. However, once you get over that hill, the creative choices it takes do largely work in order to create a new narrative. Your liking of the film will come down to whether you think a new story is necessary. For me, T2 is still the perfect ending to the franchise, but if there has to be a Terminator 3, it may as well be this one. Although, even then, Dark Fate is occasionally brought down by its execution. The writing at times feels clunky and heavy-handed, occasionally telling rather than showing. There's one particular future sequence which is most guilty of this, which is easily the weakest scene in the film. There is also a last-minute plot contrivance which featured no setup. However, for the most part, it's pretty solid, and keeps up a necessary momentum and urgency to the narrative, while finding a few character beats in between. Tonally, the film is much more in line with the first two. It never gets as silly as T3 and Genesis did, and finds a similar balance of humour as T2. The 15 rating that has been missing from previous entries helps the film feel less cartoony and genuinely intense at times. The film's action set pieces struggle to win me over to begin with. An opening fight between Grace and police officers, and an opening chase sequence were too choppy and incoherent for my tastes. There is an over-reliance on CG effects, which creates a weightlessness at times, especially when CG body doubles are used in place of practical stunt work. However, as the film continues, the action seems to improve with each sequence. The hand-to-hand combat becomes visceral and clean, and even more CG-heavy sequences are directed with the right intensity to feel believable. There's a scene at the border, which is particularly enjoyable. However, even then, Miller's direction struggles to capture Cameron's, although that's a tall order for any director. It's certainly a great improvement over the bland direction of Genesis, but it's still missing the visual texture that makes those first 2 films so compelling. The film almost feels too bright and clean. Stylistically, it doesn't quite line up, and feels more like Miller's previous film, Deadpool. Junkie XL's score also fails to excite, despite being seemingly perfect for the project on paper. His score is ultimately serviceable, but also forgettable, with the only memorable moments being the reprise of the classic Terminator theme. A big part of why the film becomes more enjoyable as it goes on is the return of Sarah Connor to the story, played by a delightfully foul-mouthed Linda Hamilton. The film works hard to properly contextualize her being involved in the plot, and giving her real reason to be there, although the creative choices taken will disappoint some fans. The characterization and arc of her character, though, doesn't really take off until the introduction of the T-800. The relationship between Sarah and the T-800 is fascinating, and may be the first compelling piece of drama to be in the Terminator series since T2. Schwarzenegger and Hamilton bounce off each other wonderfully, and it's a delight to see them on screen together again. The T-800 particularly feels as well like a breath of fresh air. Miller and Cameron have pushed the character to be something we haven't seen before, and Schwarzenegger completely owns it with an earnestness to the character. It feels like the logical next step following T2, unlike going backwards as previous entries did. This leads to an emotional beat towards the end which surprisingly landed for me. Again, a first for the franchise since T2. Mackenzie Davis as Grace also does an excellent job. She feels the most natural in her performance, and sells both the caring and badass side to her character. However, I was left wanting more from her character. The same goes for Natalie Reyes as Dani. Both characters are hampered by familiar structure and story beats, succumbing to it as they take on roles we've seen before. The connection between the two doesn't feel wholly earned. Both are brought down by some weak writing during a reveal sequence which could be seen coming from a mile away. Natalie Reyes starts off the film on quite solid footing as the vulnerable factory worker who doesn't understand why this is happening to her. However, there's a shift in her character about halfway through that rings false. I struggled to see the progression, and Reyes doesn't entirely sell it. I also thought Gabriel Luna as the Rev 9 did a magnificent job. He really sells the body language of the Terminator, but was also able to differentiate him from the previous ones. He cracks a few jokes, and also attempts to bargain at one point. The character feels genuinely threatening, helped by the 15 rating, although I felt as though his new ability to split wasn't fully taken advantage of or utilised. He essentially does what Robert Patrick's T-1000 was able to do, despite more opportunities being on the table. The film also uses his character to provide some modern updates to the franchise, notably the use of image surveillance and drone technology in order to find its targets. It's riveting to watch him hunt. He's certainly the most brutal Terminator yet, and I imagine the one with the highest kill count. Ultimately though, the film works. I struggle to get on board with the creative choices and direction it takes to begin with, but as the film continues, it seems to get stronger and stronger, both filmmaking wise and narratively, partly due to the emphasis on the Sarah T-1000 story arc in the second half, although the new characters still struggle to land. But by the end, Terminator Dark Fate earns most of the narrative choices it's taken, and also its place in the franchise as a good enough, entertaining sequel to T2.